Y'all are good, because I'm from New York City and it's 12 o'clock. I'm just letting y'all know, so thank y'all for the patience, and I'm going to try to do my best to stay up. Thank you, first of all, EcoFarm, for inviting me to be here. I always tell people the power of asking. The reason why I'm here, because someone asked me to be here. So keep that in mind when you look around and you see who's not here and who needs to be here, and to make sure that this room, again, reflects the diversity and inclusion that is needed. So I'm going to start off about, talking really about myself from the very beginning. So when I was young, farming was looked at as slave labor. It was part of a narrative that was spoken and talked to us growing up. I grew up in New York City, the Big Apple, surrounded by tall buildings. The closest thing that came to a farm was a park for me. And as for animals, you had to either go to a zoo or a circus. Sure, I could see a horse on a carousel or pulling people in Central Park. That's as far as I got to see barn animals. So far removed from the land that our food source, it never occurred to me how lost I really was. Everything came from a supermarket or a department store. All our food, we never asked the question, who was the farmer? Where did it come from? All I knew is that my mom was a good cook and that we had 3 meals a day. Even in school, agriculture was barely mentioned unless it was pertaining to a nursery rhyme like Old MacDonald had a farm or 3 little piggies went to market. For many of us, our families left the South for a better life. The South was the past, a place that you sent young people who misbehaved or were in trouble. The South was a place for Jim Crow and segregation, a place that no colored folks wanted to go. Many had land that they owned, but vowed never to go back. And their children, they too never wanted to go back. So many of us we didn't go back. We either sold the land for little or nothing, or was lost because we didn't pay taxes, or was taken from us because of racism and violence. Even as I got older, I began growing my own food, and many of my elders would bark at me and say, how could you find power and pleasure and gratitude in growing your own food? They would say, oh, Ms. Washington, why are you growing food? That's such hard work. It's sharecropping, it's slave labor. And then I would understand the relationship that they were talking about, but also understand the relationship between food and health, because I was a physical therapist at the time, and many of them were having diet-related diseases. And so as I began talking to them, I used to say to them, but remember going into the chicken coop and getting that egg and cracking that egg into that frying pan, and the yolk, which wasn't yellow but was orange, would rise to the top, and when you ate it would melt in your mouth. And how about those morning breakfasts and Sunday dinners where the smell would permeate throughout the house? And then all of a sudden, reality would set in. They would sit back and they would say, you know, Miss Washington, my mother and my grandmother lived up till they were 90 years of age. They were hardly sick a day in their life. They used food as medicine. And now here we are in our 70s and 80s with type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obesity, on and on and on. And many of you know family members that have these same diet-related diseases, and on top of that are taking medications. Then all of a sudden they will remember how good the food was compared to what they were eating now. Food that was no longer fresh, that came in a can or a box, with the ingredients that they couldn't pronounce, or meats that were filled with antibiotics and hormones, and fruits and vegetables sprayed with pesticides to keep the insects from eating, but yet now they were eating and it was deemed somehow safe. Given the fact that time and time again, I used to hear people say that our food system is broken. And I used to believe that. I used to drink the Kool-Aid. until I realized this is doing exactly what it set out to do. A caste system, subsidizing cheap food in poor neighborhoods and healthy food in wealthy ones. So I would ask the question time and time again, here we are in the richest country in the world. We grow more food, we waste more food, and yet that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most. Hunger and poverty is everywhere. And right now, it's in the most unhealthiest communities, both urban and rural. Every second, someone is going to bed hungry, homeless, getting their food from a soup kitchen or a food pantry. Some of them are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And since the mid-1980s, we have seen a steady rise in diet-related diseases, as the ones I mentioned. But it wasn't always like that, folks. In the 1900s, 40% of our population lived on farms, now 2%. We had over 50 million farmers, 500 million in terms of farmland. 70% of our food came from the farm. We knew our farmer and we knew where our food was coming from. We now have seen a decrease in farm size from over 3 million to almost 1.9 million, but less for people of color. And it's estimated that by 250, we'll have an additional 9 billion people on this planet, up from 7 billion. And yet what I find so astonishing, folks, is the fact that our grandparents and our great-grandparents who are farmers never went to a grocery store or bodega. They grew their own food. They never used chemicals or caged their animals. Their stories about wisdom was handed down from generation to generation, becoming more powerful and sacred until we started to move away from the land and lost interest. Our ancestors never thought about owning land, never thought about owning animals, never thought about owning people, and never thought about owning seeds. So has the land of milk and honey become the land of greed and money? How have we allowed a handful of companies to control our food system? So what happened, folks? Well, we've gone from monocropping to farming on a single commodity such as corn and wheat, poultry, and pork and beef. We spend billions and billions of dollars on subsidies, at one point spending over $259 million on a product of high fructose corn syrup. We have gone from a local economy to a global economy because of trade agreements, from home cooking to fast food, from seasonality to growing and eating food all year round. But at what cost? What sacrifice have we made? Can we actually say that we're much better because we are less labor intensive, more efficient and specialized, or a system where we grow more food, waste more food, import more food, and export less? Which boils down to the American diet. An American diet at one point was plant-based, full of fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains, and now animal-based. As a result, our caloric intake has gone from 2,000 calories per capita to over 3,800 calories per capita. And yet, we spend billions and billions of dollars on treatment and not prevention. And do you know why? Because there's big money in people who are sick and poor. And let's look at our food companies, because they also have an input in our food system. So do you really think that you have an experience when you go to the supermarket? No, it's already pre-planned for you. Companies know exactly what you're going to buy and how much money you're going to spend. They call that marketing and advertisement. In your typical supermarket experience, when you walk in, you know that your produce, your dairy, and your meats are up along the wall. Up and down the aisles are your frozen foods, your cereals, your canned goods. And the companies that have the most money in name brands, those items are usually eye level. But if you go into my community, and I like to do the Twilight Zone, do, because you all of a sudden are hit with the colors of fruits and vegetables. The ingredients will say high in terms of salt and sugars, with no nutritional values. And yet the companies know who is out there in terms of our target audience. Who are they? Our children. Because our children spend billions and billions of dollars on junk food because of advertisement, because of that toy that they see on Saturday morning cartoons, and the leverage that they have of their parents to spend money on junk food. The bottom line is that we have companies that will make and market a product regardless of its nutritional value or its effect on our health. They will co-opt our words, such as all natural, organic, full of vitamins and minerals. And we thought that this commercialization and industrialization of our food system would enable us to feed people with less labor and cheap resources, meaning bigger, better, faster. We become so lost, so mechanized, that we lost a generation of people who have no idea where their food comes from or who grew it. They could care less about the ethics behind a growing food and the danger that lurks behind a food system that is so tenuous. This apathy is not a conscious one, but the fact of the matter that we have placed the responsibility and safety of our food system in the hands of government and lobbyists. We no longer eat at the table. Many times our food is taken in our bedroom or family room where we're watching TV or playing video games. We become so detached from our food source that we have a whole generation who could believe that a tomato is truly grown in the supermarket. This gap will continue if we don't take back our narrative, our story, from companies that would have us believe that ketchup should be labeled a vegetable, or that GMO labeling is not in the best interest of the public. And yet what bothers me, folks, is that I see the most vulnerable populations, people being forced to spend money on my three groups. And this is my three groups instead of the pyramid, the USDA pyramid group. It's the junk food first. The junk food, cheap, low cost, imitates the color and flavors of food with chemicals and additives. The fast food, cheap, convenient, hidden dangers, and addictive. And then the best, the processed food, which was supposed to revolutionize the 20th century. The political brief and construct would have us to believe that people in areas where there's limited access to food or to a supermarket is known as food deserts. So I want you to say food deserts, because that's the last time you're going to say that word, because I coined the term food apartheid. And the reason why I coined the term food apartheid is because, as mentioned before, people have food in the desert. And when you talk about food in the desert, because in our hood, first of all, no one in our hood talks about food deserts, because we do have food. What we don't have are healthy food options. And so when you talk about food desert, you're not getting the underlying problem when it comes to race and economics and demographics. And when you talk about food apartheid, people start to listen, and you start having that conversation about race, about privilege, about demographics and economics. There are many voices from the agro-food science group and corporations claiming that increasing technology is a solution for food insecurity, and that people in poor urban and rural areas are told if they want food security, all they got to do is give them a little plot so they can grow their own fruits and vegetables, have them give up soda, and exercise as if by magic eating fruits and vegetables, and exercising is going to solve the problems in the food system without looking at the institutional and structural determinants that reinforce racism in today's society. Which brings me to this next slide, and I like to talk about this next slide, food justice and food sovereignty, because people use the word food justice, and I tell people that it no longer exists. It has been co-opted. It has been co-opted because food justice, as this definition says, is a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequities. And I say that because if you are working towards food justice, it has to be transformational. That means it's not a passive movement, but an active movement. So if you're working on food justice, I don't want to hear your cookie-cutting definition, because in order to work on food justice, you have to work on social injustice. And so some of the social injustices that you have to work on is persistent race, gender, class inequities. The lack of the ability to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. How many people want to be able to own their own job and have their own business and have their own land, but yet there are always roadblocks in the way to prevent us from having that? The lack of land. The economic, in terms of lacking living wage jobs, and I'm not talking about the jobs that are in Walmart or the jobs that are in McDonald's and Wendy's. Understanding the historical content of trauma. We cannot do this work if we don't understand the content of trauma of people who have been oppressed. And that oppression and that trauma has traveled from generation to generation to generation. And next, power. Power, we'll be talking about that later. But understanding the ramifications when it comes to power. And then when you thought you're going to be good in terms of social justice, you're going to sprinkle and you're going to say, well, you know, I know how to define social justice, so I'm going to go up and bump it a little bit more, and I'm going to add to it food sovereignty. Another word that has been co-opted. Because in order to understand food sovereignty, you have to understand that it has come from the global South, from people who have been, indigenous people who have been fighting for governance, fighting for the power to own their own land and to grow their own food. But yet we have co-opted that term and also have interchanged the term between food justice and food sovereignty. Yet both principles place equity in decision-making, the distribution of power and resources against people who have been marginalized with people who have power over. Power. In order for power to be moved, it has to be changed. Very difficult to do, folks, because power is like a drug. You gotta have it. But as long as we have a food system that embraces a power dynamic society, it will remain stagnant and resistant to change. And how often do we really understand how powerful food is? We never go into a grocery store and ask, who grew the food? Were the workers paid a living wage? Was it sprayed with pesticide or insecticide? Or is the person growing the food given the true value of their crop? From small farmers and growers and farm workers, a healthy food system is not just about growing food, but making sure all parties along the food chain are treated humanely. Food has now become a commodity, folks, based on profits and not people. In order for the food system to change, we must face the fact that it's about sharing or giving up power. A food system that is dominated by white privilege with a historical framework of power over has to acknowledge that power and give it up. And so when does the power dynamic in society show up? Well, it shows up when you don't have it, as hunger, when you can't afford it, as poverty, when it's killing you, because it's diet-related disease, when you don't deserve it because someone told you that because they have organic food and you're not eating organic food, that they're better, or the fact that we have companies who are controlling our food systems, such as Big Ag. So what are people doing in the name of justice? Well, they're reclaiming land and forming community land trusts. They're growing food that's culturally appropriate, that they can afford. They are saving seeds in defiance of corporations who feel that their God-given right to control seeds, because in essence, who are we? We are seeds, and we allow companies to control seeds and patent seeds, then we're right down the line of being next. Growing herbs for healing and medicine, forming cooperatives, and leveraging the power of collaboration. Urban and rural must work together. Writing history from stories once told in a textbook and learned at school, and not being taught by indigenous people. Because Columbus didn't discover America. America was already here. Forming community-based farmers markets, mobile markets, food boxes, and food shares. Supporting local and small farmers, especially farmers of color, and having conferences and workshops that talk about the issues given by people who look like us and given by people who look like me. What are some of our action steps? So what are some of the action steps that we can take? Because, you know, when I finish speaking, I want y'all to be able to leave here with some action step, because talk is cheap. And we come to these conferences and we get this information and we never use it. So these are some of your action steps and your homework assignments. Powered share, not power over. Share and tell your story. So I tell young people, if you got grandparents and great-grandparents, take out your iPhones and Samsung Galaxies and sit down and capture those stories. Because if you don't, 10, 20 years from now, people will tell you that your family never farmed, that you got your food from a grocery store. Break bread and share a meal. Make yourself feel uncomfortable to be comfortable. When I'm in that dining hall, come to me and sit at my table and ask me how I'm doing. Make yourself feel uncomfortable to talk to someone who's different than you are. Share resources, and I always tell people the 3 principles, because I live in a low-income neighborhood. And I'm tired of people coming into my neighborhood because they want to tell my people where the nearest food pantry and soup kitchen is, or let me sign you up for some welfare. And again, it's changing my lens of how I look at poor people or marginalized people, because as poor and marginalized, we are strong and resilient people. And so I tell people, and I imagine this each and every day, come into my neighborhood with 3 things. You come into any low-income neighborhood, whether it's urban or rural, with opportunity, with capital, with land or resources, and people who were once deemed powerless now become powerful. And lastly, let's all develop and promote youth leadership. Folks, let's face some facts. Average age of a farmer is 58 years of age. A woman farmer, 59. We need to talk about the next generation of farmers. And so sometimes farmers, say to me, well, Karen, what can I do? And I say, well, you got 100 acres, 50 acres, 15 acres. Sometimes, you can set aside 5 or 10 acres and give a farmer 1 acre that they can grow on. We have to start thinking about the resources in such a way on how we can share land instead of saying that there's no more land. So we have to do something different. So let's think about how we can change that wording, that concept of what we don't have, and think about what we do have, and not what we need, but what we want. When you need something, you come from a place of deficit. When you want something, you come from a place of power. And finally, let us raise our voices and shovels. We must reach across communities, states, and nations. This is not a local movement, folks. This is a global movement. As more people are living longer, we need the next generation of young farmers. What that will look like depends on you. We must play a role that a healthy, just food system must be out there for everyone. It must be diverse and inclusive. And when we talk about being diverse and inclusive, if it's not diverse and inclusive, which stems from power, it's tokenism. And so think about when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it must include giving up power. Lastly, I'll leave y'all with this. To grow your food gives you power. You know why you grew it, who you grew it for. You grew it for yourself. You grew it for your community. You grew it for your family. I want to take this time to thank you for having me. It is late. I know it's late, but at least you sat here to listen to what all three of us had to say, all three of us who are women. Because it is the woman. It is the woman that is going to change the food system. We are here. We're not going away. We will be at the forefront of change to make sure that everyone has a right to food that is fresh, local, and healthy. Thank you so much. I made it! 12 o'clock.